This is apropos. Well, due to its wartime past, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution that limits its military to self-defense. It's also long maintained a strict export control on arms exports while heavily relying on the US military presence in the region, as well as imports of expensive American arsenals. Now, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is calling for advanced discussions on revising the constitution, setting up a panel tasked with reviewing the country's security and defense policies as regional tensions escalate. Selina Sykes has more.
Carrying placards with anti-war slogans, around 50,000 people gathered at this park in Tokyo on Sunday, Japan's Constitutional Memorial Day. This year's public holiday, marking when Japan's pacifist constitution came into force after World War II, is especially important for protesters to voice their opposition to the government's calls for changes to the supreme law.
This is just what Japanese militarists did during the imperial era. They're setting the country on a path toward China and pursuing imperialism.
I wasn't born back then, but I believe we are repeating the history we learned a lesson from. And that makes me very angry.
The wording of the constitution, written by US occupation forces, has remained unchanged since it went into effect on the 3rd of May 1947. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi wants to change that. She set her sights on Article 9, the so-called pacifist clause, which forbids Japan from threatening or using military force to settle international disputes. The Conservative leader and others in her Liberal Democratic Party say that the text should periodically be updated to reflect the demands of the times, amid growing security threats from North Korea and China. While controversial legislation passed a decade ago theoretically allows Japan to exercise collective self-defense, Takaichi has turned reform into a focal point of her administration since being elected in October last year. In April, her cabinet approved scrapping a ban on exporting lethal weapons, a move which this scholar believes is a de facto constitutional amendment.
The government has lifted a lethal weapons export ban, increased the share of defense spending in GDP, and is pushing for the establishment of a National Intelligence Committee. I believe the exclusively defense-oriented policy under Article 9 is being undermined.
Any revisions to the constitution would need a two-thirds majority in both houses of Japan's parliament or a majority in a national referendum. Recent polls show a public desire for having a national conversation, but no clear consensus on whether and what to revise.
We're joined now by Giulio Pugliese, lecturer in strategic communications at King's College London. He's also director of the EU Asia project at the European University Institute. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. So the Prime Minister is setting up a 15-member panel of experts. What exactly do you think they're going to be looking at in detail here? And what will the government then do with its recommendations when it issues them in a few months' time?
I think the change of the constitution has been effectively the sacred grail of the Liberal Democratic Party since its own founding in 1955. And Takaichi would love to actually leave a legacy as the leader that has changed the constitution, even if just to recognize a de facto change, such as recognizing that the self-defense forces are to all effects armed forces, so cosmetic rhetorical changes that keep up with the times. The problem is, as you say and in your segment, that opposition is very strong, and so they will have to be walking a very fine line between constitutional amendments that will have to be approved by a special majority of both houses, and henceforth a normal majority at a referendum. And so it is very possible that the recommendations will be simple, and we'll have to wait for new rounds of elections in the upper house.
So do you think then that the Prime Minister is essentially correct in suggesting that constitutions should be updated to reflect the demands of the times? Japan, of course, is not the only country that be struggling with this kind of issue.
Yes, I think that the constitutional system of Japan that hasn't been changed since 1947. And this is a unicum in many ways. Italy has changed and amended its constitution multiple times, should simply reflect the new realities. The only problem is that it hasn't been done so formally and legalistically by constitutional change, but by constitutional reinterpretation so far. The 2014 constitutional reinterpretation by executive fiat and the peace and security bills of 2015, to all effects, changed the reinterpretation of the constitution by government will, but there hasn't been a buy-in from the people of Japan, from the citizens and the voters of Japan and the representatives in the Diet of Japan. And so it would make perfect sense to, at the very least, acknowledge the new realities. But again, as your segment showed and did so excellently, there needs to be a buy-in from the people. And this is not a given still.
And do you think, though, that eventually people will come on board when they kind of look at the mounting regional threat around them from the likes of even Russia, but China and North Korea, more closely speaking?
That is not a given, because the Japanese ethos, as much as we like samurai movies and militaristic Japan narratives that come also from Japanese rivals, is still deeply entrenched into an anti-militarist discourse, an anti-militarist ethos that is particularly strong in the elder generation. And that's the reason why the opposition parties have a strong support from voters who tend to be aged 60 years old and older. And that is the reason why it is not a given still that the constitutional amendment would actually fly first within the Diet. And so we will actually have to wait for new upper house election rounds, maybe one, maybe two, but also the results of a referendum.
And it would depend as well, of course, on what specific issue is put to the people in such a referendum as well, Giulio. A little bit more widely speaking, as Japan is definitely moving towards boosting its military capacity, do you think that's the right course of action that the Prime Minister is taking there?
Well, it does make sense. It does make sense in the face of the threats that you highlighted, especially from China and North Korea, less so from Russia, which is clearly occupied with its own western flank and perhaps with its own economic and domestic political situation. But speaking of the potential challenges coming from China and from North Korea, the reforms that the Takaichi administration has initiated that follow in the footsteps of her mentor Abe Shinzo are very much in line with the trend of times. That is a more autonomous security policy. And along with the deindustrialization of Japan, the ability for the Japanese business actors to reindustrialize in what is now a booming sector, that is the military sector. And Japan can become a global actor in the military procurement space. So it does make sense. It makes strategic and economic and industrial sense. But again, there has to be a buy-in from the Japanese population. And I would insist that this is not a given.
And NATO as well has been taking an interest here, representatives visiting Japan to discuss further deepening ties with the military alliance. Do you think that we might see a future where Japan actually joins NATO if that Article 9 that we've been discussing of the Constitution is eventually removed?
NATO, by virtue of its own treaty and the language embedded in the treaty can't possibly, in my opinion, extend to spaces other than the North Atlantic. Countries such as France have made it abundantly clear that extending NATO promises of mutual security to faraway countries such as Japan will be out of touch with the reality of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I would also argue that what Japan would need from NATO countries, such as the ones that, of course, visited Japan in the numbers, the 30 ambassadors you mentioned, would actually be an indirect support. First and foremost, the legitimization of the Takaichi government's reforms. And this has domestic political effects, and I wouldn't discount them outright. But also the potential for materiel, meaning war material, flowing from one theater to the other in the case of a contingency. And this makes also business sense with defense industrial complexes of Europe feeding the Japanese war machine in case of a crisis surrounding the Taiwan Strait or surrounding Japan-China relations or potentially even North Korea, going all the way to Japan in the case, of course, logistics and materiel can't keep flowing from Japan or, of course, from the United States. And this is something that I should have emphasized before. This is not just about the rise of China or North Korea's nuclear and missile breakout. The story and the predicament that Japan is facing is more or less the predicament that we are facing. That is that this happens at the same time where we cannot take for granted the security guarantees and the defense industrial guarantees, including the contracts that had been signed in terms of military procurement and materiel coming from the United States, that cannot be taken for granted because the US faces increasingly insular instincts, perhaps limited to the Western Hemisphere, or conversely, the US is bogged down in another war in the Middle East, where its own materiel, which has been promised to Europe or East Asia, it can't go flowing to these markets as promised in contracts that have been signed long ago or that have to be signed in the near term.
Giulio, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for that analysis, though. That's Giulio Pugliese, Lecturer in Strategic Communications and also Director of the EU Asia Project at the European University Institute. Thanks so much.